All right, so today's episode is again sponsored by the Modern Meathead community, who, if any members want to come in live, we're patiently waiting here. Today, we're going to talk about a sort of general framework for lower body training, and a quick sort of aside before we get started. Ethan and I were discussing before this episode sort of where to take things, and to get into each lower body muscle group specifically will take a very long time, or at least usually longer than we anticipate. So we're going to try to, for this episode, aim to talk more generally, general principles, prior mistakes or ways that we've sort of changed each of our training over time, and just general rules of thumb that you can apply to yourselves and to your clients if you're a trainer. And then in subsequent episodes, or maybe if we have time at the end of this one, we'll start to get into specifics, calves, hamstrings, quads, etc. But we will leave the specific episode for next week, to really dive deeply into, just specifics that are more relevant to each of the muscle groups individually. So this will kind of be a general overview, and then we'll dive deeper, more specifically next time or toward the end of this episode, so it doesn't end up being 6 hours. So just to kind of start things off, um, I want to kind of talk today about, uh, if you can imagine a lower body training T chart, things to keep in mind in terms of maybe strategies that we want to sort of lean more towards the to do side of the T chart, and then things maybe not to do, or maybe just to be a little bit more cognizant and cautious of, especially as you become more advanced. I think these things just tend to become increasingly important, especially in the context of injury risk management. Upper body injury stuff is obviously still very relevant, but I tend to find that, like, with the lower body training, you have just so much involvement with the spine in so many cases. So I think we'll end up probably talking a decent amount about that. Obviously, both of us have experience. Most people probably do with spine related issues. So just to kind of start things off, I thought that we would start off with the general discussion around like squats and hinges, and just because that's kind of like where people, I think, from a really general standpoint, start off with thinking about this stuff, is like putting lower body exercises into two distinct categories. And people often say, well, a squat is something where, your whole body altogether kind of translates more upward and downward, more vertically. You can think of that as like more 90 degrees from, the floor. And then a hinge is something that is totally distinct from that, which is something that is more akin to like a horizontal translation, something like a deadlift or an RDL. And I think that's a helpful framework to have to begin with, especially if you're kind of training on your own and you're looking for really, really general rules to follow. But I think it has certain limitations, and I kind of want to get into some of those because a lot of times, especially depending on who you are, how you're structured, what your experience is, and how skilled you are with executing these motions, squats and hinges can end up being very, very similar from a stimulus standpoint. In fact, I would say almost more often than not, if we're talking about like a free weight barbell motion, squats and hinges end up being or looking very similar, right? Where you often see someone put a bar on their back and they're, doing what they think is kind of more of a squatty type thing, something that they would label more as like a knee dominant motion. They're doing it in a way where like they're hinging over a lot. There's a lot of stress on their spine, there's a lot of stress on their hips. And so as a result, I think a lot of people maybe struggle to feel quad soreness with a squatting type motion. So I think that rather than categorizing based on, gross motion, it's generally helpful to categorize based on joint and joint structure. So I prefer to use terms like knee dominant and hip dominant, which is entirely dependent on, obviously the way that you perform the motion, but more specifically, the way that you perform the motion in relationship to the direction of force, right? Because you could actually do something, and I don't want to get too specific now, but we can get into some examples later, where something may look very hingy, again, from a gross perspective, that could be very knee dominant from the perspective of force. Um, just to give an example, like, the whole knee over toes thing, I think has limitations in this regard. You could also do something that looks to be quite knee dominant, that based on the constraints of the exercise, based on the way that you're cueing it, could end up being more hip dominant. So as a framework, again, I don't think that squats versus hinges is unhelpful, but I think just right off the bat, it's important to kind of zoom out and maybe take people into a little bit of a different perspective, uh, which is just one that is more sort of joint focused as opposed to more gross motion focused. And so, with that in mind, I kind of wanted to ask you, start off by talking just a little bit about some specific anecdotes in relationship to the way that maybe like your training originally sort of started off with like a lower body framework and then kind of like where it's at now. And obviously that's a sort of long discussion or could be a long journey to kind of go through. So to maybe hone in more specifically on your journey, I would ask like, is that something that resonates with you in terms of just like how you originally sort of came into the gym? Like, did you have that sort of squat versus hinging relationship framework? And if so, has that changed over time? Maybe something, to be something more similar to what I'm describing. And if it hasn't, sort of maybe why it hasn't, or just, anything that's related to that, if that makes sense.
Mhm. So when I started training, the goal was sport, specifically football. Um, and I remember the first time I walked into the gym, and I think maybe dissimilar to some of like the influences that people have now. Like I didn't really have a lot of prior, education or outside influence that gave me like biases in any way. Like I think it's probably more common nowadays for someone to walk into the gym and, whether it's because they were older, like I said, I was 12, 13 years old at the time, or just, access to things through, say, social media, or even like where the internet is now versus where it was 20 years ago.
Yeah.
Um, my assumption is that a lot of people are walking into the gym now with some biases and with some preconceived notions about what's correct, what's incorrect. Because, even the average person, like on the subway, will point to my legs and say, oh, you're a bodybuilder, and then they'll have some commentary on what the correct way to train legs is when they clearly haven't worked out a day in their life. So
Yeah.
I wasn't really coming in with a whole lot of, preconceived notions, but I think because it was such a rewarding and enjoyable process for me and something that like I excelled in early on, um, relatively quickly I got into, studying the topic and, picked up some books that were more so biased towards like, performance type training. Um, and simultaneously watching some bodybuilding videos at the same time, so I had a little bit of influence from one side that was kind of like sports performance, Olympic lift, plyometric, like, but maybe more so just kind of like uh heavier compound multi-joint lifts, and then on the other end just for fun, watching the guys like Ronnie Coleman and Jay Cutler DVDs. um so because my early influence was football, it was really just like what are the older guys doing, what is our strength coach having us do, like what are we being tested for, and just really for no other reason other than chance. Like deadlift wasn't really something that our program focused on a lot, so squat became more of like the thing that I was like doing higher volumes on and like focused on early. And later I found out that I was probably a better squatter than deadlifter, and something that I could just sustain. Um, it's better from a low back perspective. Um, so anyway, like I got really good at back squatting very quickly. It was like back squat and bench press were probably like the two biggest things, but there was still plenty of like accessory lifts, not full on bodybuilding, but very much I think what people nowadays would call almost like a power building approach.
Yeah.
It's like, I'm maybe doing some ascending load, working up to like a top set, on your barbell, dumbbell, row, barbell, dumbbell, bench press, back squat kind of thing. I don't think there was a whole lot of hinging actually early in my program, but to your point, my back squat was also probably very hingy as well. So I think that was kind of my initial inroad into it. And now, 15, 20 years later, my program looks a whole lot different. And I think now it's a very professionally oriented goal where it's like, it's not about coming into the gym and it being like a team building experience or being an experience of like building my confidence per se. But it's more of an experience of like a very specific goal that I'm willing to trade some of those things for. So it's really about being efficient, whether that be time efficient or efficient, in regards to getting the most amount of stimulus with the least amount of like, side effects. Um, so I very much enjoy the like totality of the process of bodybuilding right now and being able to, make little tweaks and see those outcomes, in my results. But my training nowadays is not so much focused on like how does it, make me feel emotionally and like how much weight can I put on the bar, but more so like what do I think in theory is the best way to get this very, very specific outcome.
Mhm. Yeah. So I think there's a lot of interesting stuff in there. And the first one that comes to mind is just the concept of having specific attachments to exercises, which I don't think there's anything necessarily wrong with, unless you don't really have a clear understanding of maybe why you're doing that exercise to begin with. Like if you're someone who just um, doesn't really like to think. Like my brother's a good example of this. He'll ask me the occasional question, but like, he's been training for I guess at this point, 10 years. He's in really good shape. He's not someone who ever really has joint pain. He knows the general concepts of like how do I control emotion? Like how does it something look when I control it versus how does it look when I don't? And he like just does, the basic stuff and doesn't really have a problem with it. But he's not necessarily tied to like thinking that squats are the best or deadlifts are the best. He kind of just does what he likes, and I think that's perfectly fine. And I think that a lot of people can benefit more from just enjoying a program rather than, thinking about it if they're not too inclined. But what I see as problematic is when people like you were saying, now get sort of indoctrinated into believing that like certain movements are must do and certain movements need to be done for progress to occur. I think that's where you start to, when you move into the direction of like attachment that is not based off of experience, but that attachment that is based off of maybe something you've heard or something that some advanced bodybuilder or powerlifter has said. So many of the things that I believed early on came just directly from powerlifting, and so many people entered the realm of lifting on social media and YouTube through like the powerlifting lens. And so people sort of enter lifting through there. And it's actually very cool and refreshing to work with people and hear people talking to me about how they enter the gym with no expectations of like what is good and what isn't good, quote unquote good. um and just to give one anecdote that I had recently, my cousin, who is going to college now, just started training lower body. He's been training upper body for a good amount of time, and for whatever reason, it's not that important. He wanted to start training his legs, just for various reasons. He was like, it's time. I got to take the next step, which I was like, great, like awesome. Training half your body is probably going to be important. Um, and because he's seen a lot of other people do squats, he was like, huh, why don't I just like get under a barbell and try to squat. And he's like naturally a pretty strong guy. Like, so he can just slap a plate on there and start like feeling, how it feels. Like the average person probably wouldn't be able to do that, but he's fairly strong guy. And after a couple sets, he was like, you know what? This like doesn't really feel too comfortable on my shoulders. It kind of feels like I'm having a tough time balance. Why don't I just like go over to that like leg press thing, kind of looks like a squat, and just like see how it goes. And, he went from feeling the pressure on his back and a lot of uncomfortable stuff in his spine and a weird sense of balance on the squat to then going on to the leg press and being like, wow, I only feel my quads, I only feel my glutes, I only feel the stuff around my hips that I want to feel. I'm just going to do this thing instead. And that, yeah, go ahead.
But Ben, if he doesn't squat, how is he ever going to be able to squat in real life when it comes time?
Yeah, yeah, exactly. And for those maybe that um didn't see Ethan's smirking smirking facial expression, um I think that is a really common pitfall and something that you can't really call it super logical, but that is the common fallacy of like the functional training movement is to basically say that like something that is that represents real life conditions would somehow be more beneficial for promoting function in real life. I don't think number one that there's any research that would actually substantiate that. I don't even necessarily know how you would create a hypothesis that could substantiate that. Like if you compared squats to leg presses, what would you in real life be comparing it to? Like what is the actual metric that you would be comparing it to? Um, Ultimately, in either case, I just look at it as like, okay, what in situation A and squatting situation is being called upon to do work, to contract, and then what in situation B is being, in the leg press is being called upon to do work and to contract. And in either case, there's obviously a lot of overlap, right? You have stress on your knee, stress on your hip, stress on your ankle and your foot to some degree. But in the case of the leg press, you have a much easier time, we'll say, recruiting leg stuff as compared to the squat where you may have a much more difficult time recruiting leg stuff because of how unconstrained the motion is. So, if you're a beginner and you're having trouble learning just how to press your foot through something just as a skill, it's probably a really good idea to create a situation where your movement options are restricted to really only being able to do that thing. Right. And, take this to the extreme where people are still squatting on Bosu balls. People are having their 70-year-old clients stand on Bosu balls, just obviously with their body weight alone or maybe added load. And, the claim goes something like, if I'm better able to manage my body in space on the squat, then I will be more functional as a human. And again, I don't see any reason to believe that that would be the case. And anecdotally, I certainly haven't observed that. In fact, I've observed the opposite, where I've seen people who maybe have just had different kinds of pains running or biking because they like to bike, having done just normal quote unquote hypertrophy movements like leg pressing, and motions that are more constrained, those other things have improved for those people, just doing those things alone. There was no sense that they needed to be able to do this sort of gym mimicry, which ends up just being we'll say less effective exercise for their particular goals at the particular times that they're doing them. So, I think this was a really, really refreshing exchange that I had with my cousin, which was just like this person who had a totally blank slate and who was open-minded because of that. He just was able to make that decision that was more appropriate for him because he wasn't arbitrarily tied to a specific exercise because of something that he had heard or because of something that, someone in the gym had told him that he needed to do. And I think that this is kind of demonstrated in your story and your progression over time toward what we'll say are more specific exercises or more constrained exercises, where it's like you have been open-minded enough to over time revise your plan and change your mind about what is best for you, right? So the takeaway from that is not that leg presses are better than squats. It's just that you shouldn't really be tied. It would be equally as foolish, I think, to tie yourself to the leg press and then to just ignore squatting altogether, right? There are things that are involved in a squat that are obviously not in a leg press, and that may have specific application, especially for someone who just wants to feel like they can balance over their feet as they're doing a motion like that, right? So I think that's a really good paradigm to sort of shift to, is just this one that's a little bit more open-minded and a little bit less rigid and dogmatic. Um, because you basically just give yourself an increased likelihood that you're going to choose the thing that's appropriate for you, even if you're someone who, like my cousin, has no idea really mechanically what the differences are, but he knows that like one thing just feels more like he wants it to feel than another thing. And I think that's a good sort of lesson, I think, for anyone who's listening to take away, especially if they're just someone who's not working with a trainer or isn't a trainer themselves. I think that is a reliable strategy. Just that idea of keeping an open mind and being open to doing different things that eventually leads you to a better sort of program overall. So I don't know if you had anything else to add to that, but
Yeah, I was just like imagining a world where I never got hurt with that approach, where it was like, let's say, it was just like back squat, bench press, deadlift, whatever. And at that time the goal was training for football, like I mentioned, but as that transitioned into bodybuilding over time, I became a bit more specific and nuanced, in exercise selection. But maybe the back squat, after some shoulder surgeries that were more like contact related things from football and rugby, after I couldn't reach the bar for a barbell back squat with the shoulder surgeries, it became like a safety bar, transform bar kind of squat. And gradually it's just, become more and more refined as I've tried to solve problems. And I'm just imagining a world where like I didn't run into those problems, or just a world where people run into different problems and kind of like that troubleshooting tree. It's like, let's say this person starts off and their goal is bodybuilding, and so that the focus is build as much muscle mass as possible. And they start off with that paradigm of just like, free weights. All we have is, a squat rack, and some dumbbells. And there probably are, some people out there. Well, we know there are, for the most part, if we look at just kind of like bodybuilding history, that have done, reasonably okay with that approach. And for some people, that might be, survivable. And the next question is like, oh, it's survivable, but, are you getting the results you're looking for? Because those are two different things. Like sometimes we talk about this idea of like measuring the stimulus versus just measuring the fatigue. And like a lot of times it's much harder to measure the stimulus. Like you don't really know, am I building as much muscle as I could be building? A lot of times you just know when you run into a problem and then you solve for that problem and you kind of assume, you know, this is the best way for me to get the stimulus because you don't really have a choice. Um, but let's just say, the person is doing well, in this, they're a competitive bodybuilder or someone just, looking to build muscle mass, and, you know, all body parts are, relatively proportional. And, there's just this imaginary route where like this person never, runs into any problems. They have the perfect, shaped rib cage and perfect length, femurs and all this stuff to just sort of like make up for that. But that's, not going to be 99% of the population. There might be another percent where it's like maybe they don't run into orthopedic issues, but maybe, something's not growing as well as they want it to. And then they go down the troubleshooting route. Maybe at first it's troubleshooting of I just need to do more. And then again, you break off into another branch, and it's like more either gets them injured or more doesn't get them more results. And a lot of times it then comes back to like refining quality. So there's this kind of breakout chart that always just comes back to like identifying, what your limiting step is. And once you find that, addressing it with the best tool you have at hand. So for me, like it's easy to say like, well, the place I got to was just because of like, good analytical thinking. And I got there because I think it was like the best possible stimulus. But the reality is I got there by running into, pitfalls along the way and solving for those things. So someone else could end up in a slightly different place and still get a pretty good stimulus, just depending on like what limitations they're running into. Can they not get in enough volume because enough stimulus because their training blocks are so short because they just get exhausted within a few weeks? Are their training blocks cut short because they're running into aches and pains? Like, are they training with a ton of volume, but just not really seeing a lot of muscle growth either everywhere or in one particular area? And like each of those kind of has a little bit, of a breakout chart to go down. And I think that's the reality of kind of how we find our route, rather than a lot of people, like I mentioned, now coming into the space where they're sort of hypothesizing and contemplating how they're going to train before they really get into it and run into those issues. A lot of people are trying to quote like optimize for something that's not, a problem they have yet. So I think
Mm.
that is, one potential route. And that's not me saying like it's not a counter argument to like do back squats, don't do leg press. I don't think that you can just say like across the board one is better than the other, but just that like there's some specificity in terms of like what problem are you trying to solve, and you might not know that problem until you actually get started. So trying to really contemplate what's optimal before you experiment a little bit for yourself and start to ask questions that are specific to you. I think just in this day and age, again, it's something that people can run into, sort of the like paralysis by analysis.
Yeah, and I think that if you take that same sort of logic and you flip that on its head, where now you end up with someone who, instead of, let's say they go through a training career and they never run into a problem, the assumption of that person becomes that, well, because I didn't run into this problem, then other people probably don't run into this problem. So a good example would be like a Tom Platz, who in relationship to squats still to this day believes that like there's no better lower body exercise than the squat, right? And then meanwhile, a person who's 6'6", who's never lifted before, tries to listen to Tom Platz to do a squat, and they don't feel anything in their quads. It's just like feels like an erector exercise to them. They feel super unstable. And instead of thinking, why might this be different for me? They just hear the sort of anecdote of like squats are the best for this person, so why aren't they the best for me? And they end up just sort of trying to stick a square peg into a round hole where no matter what they do, unless they're able to really troubleshoot based on the mechanics and adjust based on the mechanics, they just can't really ever get to a place that would sort of mimic what someone else was describing as their experience. So in a similar but 180-degree opposite way, if someone never runs into a problem, it's likely that they will sort of be blinded to the potential pitfalls of what their strategy or what the negative side of their strategy may have created had they not been built the way that they were built. um, and so that's where we start to maybe move into the conversation around just segmental proportions and relative lengths, meaning just you as a human have a specific structure, and that specific structure creates a relationship in terms of the length between your shins, your femurs, and your spine, and then obviously the available motion that you have at every segment sort of in between all those things, right? So even if someone, for example, has, you hear this commonly said, like, I have really short femurs, but I'm not really good at squatting. Well, it's like there are a lot of other influences that may actually create the outcome of a squatty squat or a hingy squat. So if you're someone who, for whatever reason, structurally just has on average less dorsiflexion than the next person, meaning that they can't really fold their ankle up particularly well, even if all the other things look like based on their structure they're going to be a good squatter, that one limitation may create a situation where it ends up looking very different than one might think that it should. So I think structure plays so much of a role. So it plays such a big role in what ends up being the experience of a squat and a deadlift. Even in the context of a deadlift, something like someone's length of their arms, plays a huge role in whether a deadlift feels like shit or whether it feels like the smooth glute hamstring motion that some people report it to be. So I don't think it would be super useful to go over every possible scenario and describe like, okay, if your ankles have this and this is the length between your shin and your femur, then this will be the outcome. I don't think that would necessarily be as helpful as just saying that there are so many influences, and because there are so many influences, it's very important to not be tied to something that someone else has said, which is kind of just, I'm reiterating your point of, you have to kind of experience these things for yourself, because you may be the person who listens to Tom Platz and you try squats and it's like squats feel exactly like he says they should feel. You feel only quad, no erector, or whatever else. And that's great. And if you become more skilled and you like doing it, that's awesome. But the take home here is just simply not to be tied to any one thing for no good reason. And I think that's how over time, and this is, you can zoom out and apply this to really anything, the ability to just evolve your thinking and sort of revise your hypotheses about what might be good and why. I think that is really what separates the people who make it a really far distance in this game from the people that maybe uh, just get stuck in one place because they refuse to or can't really see the bigger picture of like what other options are available and all those things that we just sort of talked about. So, anything that comes up for you in addition to that, before I move on to some more specifics about like some of the stuff I introed?
Nope.
Cool. So, I just wanted to briefly touch on the whole knee over toe conversation and what I mentioned earlier about the outcome of an exercise being related to people's, structure and the way that they move, plus the forces involved. Um, One of the examples that Tom Purvis uses to sort of describe this whole knee over toe fallacy is just, and maybe to zoom out for a second for people who haven't heard, it's common to associate your knees traveling over your toes with more knee dominant stuff, right? So you'll see oftentimes maybe someone doing something like a reverse lunge where their knees are traveling over their toes a good amount, or at least visually, which is really just saying that their knees are traveling forward over their shoe. And depending on how big their foot is or how long their foot is, that may appear very differently. The example that Tom uses is like if someone were using a clown shoe, which I think most people have seen or could picture a clown shoe. You wouldn't ever imagine that person's knee to be moving far over their toe because the toe would be, the end of the clown shoe, right? But that's just a good example to illustrate how using arbitrary landmarks to define a stimulus is limiting. So to the example of knee over toe, if you were to do something like a wall sit, right, where you were sort of pinned up against the wall and your knees were at a 90 degree angle, right? So your knee is not far over your toe, and you were to assume that that kind of emotion would not be knee dominant, you would be missing the whole force component of that, right? Which would essentially require your knee to do most of the work based on, the friction of that scenario and how you're actually, where you're actually able to shove into in terms of the direction that you're moving. So it's not that knee over toe and the concept of knee over toe can never be useful or applicable, but like all these other things that we're discussing, I think that in a sort of myth busting way, it's helpful um, just to sort of talk about the general relationship between knees, ankles, and hips as not something that will determine a stimulus, but that really needs to be considered in tandem with this whole resistance direction conversation. A sort of similar but opposite parallel might be a situation where, like in the reverse lunge, maybe looks like your knees are traveling very far over your toes, but based around just the direction that you actually have to move, that sort of reverse lunge motion ends up being a very hip dominant motion because of the way that you're traveling and because of how you actually have to push off of the floor to move yourself forward. And a sort of similar example would be something like a forward lunge, where your knee may not be traveling over your toe at all. It may be very far behind your toe, where like in the wall sit scenario, that may end up being a very knee dominant force thing, a very quad dominant exercise, despite the fact that your knee looks like it's at a 90-degree angle. Um, or the relationship between your shin and your femur looks to be 90 degrees, despite the fact that the force direction and the way that you have to sort of navigate that exercise is very, very quad dominant. So just from an overall framework in the same way that we're discussing the limitations of thinking in terms of squats and hinges, there's a big limitation on just looking at the relationship of two segments because that doesn't consider what's happening in terms of how you're moving and then the force directions in relationship to that one segment. And so, much like the general theme here, it's important not to just focus on a single variable and then zoom in on that variable so much that you then sort of lose the forest. And I think that with lower body training, that's a common pitfall, which is just to either look at, the knee or the hip, or even just the ankle or the relationship between any one of those, and then to assume that broad strokes, that is going to be something that is actually creating a net outcome that you are looking to achieve. Um, Anything that comes up for you on that specific topic or no? Cool. So the next thing that I kind of wanted to touch on was just the idea in general, and this is all sort of overlapping, obviously, that lower body training, unlike upper body training, in some way requires loading of the spine, right? So whether we're talking about a leg extension where the loading is about as indirect as it can get, right? There's still force that needs to transmit through the spine because, whether you're doing a leg extension or a leg curl, there are muscles that cross the hip that are performing that motion. And so you need to sort of work through some amount of contraction up in the chain as compared to just the isolation of the knee or the ankle. So regardless of whether you're doing something that looks to be more quote isolated or whether you're doing something that is clearly more compound like a back squat or an RDL, all these things, all these lower body motions um, arrive us at a point along the sort of spine stimulus spectrum where a lot of lower body motions end up also being spine motions, motions that have to load your trunk to a large degree. And I think that specifically as it relates to, both of our journeys in this in this realm over time, what I have found for me personally is that performing motions that are traditionally considered to be good lower body motions like squats and deadlifts, a big part of the trade-off of those motions is just simply this concept of the rate limiter, and not even necessarily the rate limiter, because you could do a squat where your legs feel like they're the limiter. You could do a deadlift where your hips feel like they're the limiter. Um, but just the amount of stimulus that needs to occur through spinal erectors and through abs is so great in either one of those things that even if you don't perceive your spine to be, the failing muscle group or, your spine muscles to be the failing muscle group, there is so much stimulus that needs to occur through the trunk that the trunk essentially functions as the lever through which you're able to load your hips and your knees. And so over time, both you and I have trended more toward these quote isolated motions, not because they're better in absolute, but because they come with trade-offs that are maybe more local, more specific to the knee, more specific to the hip or the ankle, as compared to less specific and more sort of distributed through the spine. And so if you just follow along the traditional route of lower body training and you assume that squats and deadlifts are, where the money's at, you may end up accumulating enough volume to where your spine chronically becomes something that is constantly rate limiting you to the point potentially of injury. Doesn't mean that if you do squats and deadlifts, you're going to get hurt, but it does mean that over time, you need to consider the fact that every single rep of a squat or a deadlift that you do comes with this disproportionate amount of stress to spine and spine tissues that other motions like traditional building motions do not. So that's why for me personally, over time, I've moved away from a lot of the free weight barbell stuff. Is not because they don't stimulate your legs or they don't do anything for your legs, but rather just because if you do enough of those types of motions, even if there's not this perception of fatigue, you have to keep in mind that if you're going to choose motions that are less constrained and that are more specific to loading trunk extension or trunk flexion, that again, even if it's below the level of perception, it is something that in the background sort of lives its own life and can sort of accumulate as time goes on, especially as the need for adding load and adding volume goes up, right? The more advanced that you become. And, not only does the need for adding more stress become more relevant, but as you get more and more and more strong, the amount of stress that you put on your spine and your trunk disproportionately will raise and potentially become a rate limiter as compared to something where you, like in a leg press, don't have to manage those types of things. So for me personally, that is something that I can say directly led to enormous amounts of discomfort just in my daily life, waking up feeling like my back was just stiff all the time, feeling like my hips were stiff all the time. And, I at those times always kind of blamed myself and blamed my execution of the motions for those outcomes that I was seeing, rather than just being able to zoom out. I was sort of like myopically focused on each of the motions and how I could perform them with more efficiency or just better technique. And I was sort of just digging myself deeper and deeper over time into those holes, especially as I got stronger, where it was like within the same week, if you are doing sets of a deadlift with 500 plus pounds for, sets of like 2 to 4 for, multiple sets, plus all of the low bar or high bar back squat work or the front squat work that you're doing, like that is something that, for me was just completely unmanageable. And I was lucky enough to say that I never really had any sort of like traumatic, incident with like picking up a deadlift and just throwing my back out. But it was for me more of that example of like the chronic accumulation of that volume over time was something that just led to a total inability to repeat effective lower body training. So is that something that kind of um, was similar in your experience, or was it much more of a clear, acute moment where it was like you were performing a motion and something just felt like it snapped in your back?
Yeah, I mean, I would say probably more the latter, where I just had a number of incidents that were like closely tied to the movements themselves, whether it was, during the movement, right after the movement, or it was just, more of a chronic influence like you were describing. They were pretty easy to tie back to some of those movements. And like you mentioned, just, whether it was trying to do rehab exercises, outside of the weight room, or whether it was trying to, refine the technique on those exercises, certainly from the outside, the execution looked pretty good. But I just found inevitably, uh, whether it was, sooner or later, they would catch up to me. And that's not really my experience these days with my exercise selection. I would also say that, like, from a fatigue standpoint, and fatigue is this thing, that is a little bit broad and, undefined at times in terms of like, where are we talking about this fatigue? But there's also kind of a general sense that people have of like, I feel, exhausted, I feel beat up, like that squat was more fatiguing than that set of leg extensions. We say stuff like that, and it comes from a lot of different places, but we know sort of what the experience feels like. And there seems both anecdotally and, in the research we have on it, that axial loading, just putting load on your spine, is something that's independently fatiguing in and of itself. Like that, just for whatever reason, is seen as more of a threat, to your body than if you weren't directly loading your spine. I think that thought came up just as far as like that, whether people say it's like, oh, we're just, training more muscles, or, we have to brace harder, or it's the loads we're using, whatever it is, like we know when we get done with a set of squats, there's a lot different feeling than even a set of leg presses. The other thing too, to tack on to this, just like accumulated spine stress over a week, is the stronger you are also upper body wise and just on everything else, the more it's not just going from like your squat session to your hinge session, and especially if you're training it multiple times a week, because the paradigms now is especially a lot more in like, the natural bodybuilding community where a lot of the science, is coming out of. Um, it's training muscle groups multiple times a week and leaning towards higher volume. So all of a sudden now you might be doing, more like a knee dominant movement, two, 3 times a week. You might doing a hip dominant movement, maybe a couple times a week. But then on top of that, if you're actually strong and you're using that same paradigm of, free weights for the majority of your exercises, you're also dumbbell pressing really heavy. And it's like, okay, set one, maybe we'll warm up with, the 70s or 80s, do another warm up set, 100 plus. And now, we're getting into 120 to 150 pound dumbbells. And what's tomorrow? Tomorrow's back day. And we're going to barbell row 315. We're going to dumbbell row 150s, right? And it's like all of a sudden, every day is a massive spine loading day. And then you just exacerbate it the rest of the day. So you sit at home, and on your computer all day and, get just a couple thousand steps. And then you go to the gym and, day one, you're doing your, heavy dumbbell presses and dragging over, 100+ pound dumbbells from the bottom of the rack. And then, day two, you have your heavy squatting motions and your leg pressing and trying to go through as much range of motion as possible and getting additional spine stress there. Day three, is back day, bent over rows, dumbbell rows, all that kind of shit. And, day four, you have your hinging. And then again, like I said, usually nowadays the paradigm is multiple times a week. I think you just never really get a rest from all that. So I think it's important to, have just like you would approach rest periods for muscle groups. I think it's important to think about rest period, whether it be from, the rest of your joints or more specifically from a spine loading perspective. Like every day can't be a spine loading day. Like you're going to need some time off in between. And the stronger you get, the more relevant that's going to become. But I even see that with personal training clients. Sometimes you're like, wow, this person, can really withstand because they're not that strong. Like they can, really withstand things that I couldn't do in terms of exercise selection. And then sometimes after, 6 months or so of doing that, you realize like, no, it just took a little bit longer.
Mm-hmm.
You know, they report things that maybe they don't even realize are like back related issues. It's like, oh, my glute feels a little bit tight, or I got this kind of like, pinch in my hip, but it like runs down my leg and things like that, where they might not even feel it in their back, but you're like, oh, that might be a, sciatic or, femoral nerve kind of thing. And if you don't know what to look for in that sense, you might mistake it for, another problem. But I do see, again, when we're talking about 95% of people, 95% of people who are actually going to actively try to progress things and get stronger over time and, have the, genetics and environment to be decent at this, will not be able to survive day after day of, just heavy free weight movements without, whether by accident or purposely building in some actual off time, to sort of, you know, reset, allow, those adaptations at not just the muscular level, but also at like the, connective tissue, including, bone level.
Yeah, and one of the things that I had never really thought about to sort of dovetail off of what you were saying before I trained with you was even in the context of lower body motions that are less directly loaded at the spine, like a leg press or a hack squat, whatever, you still have to rack and unrack weights, and that in and of itself for someone who maybe hasn't trained that much could be a spine, quote unquote spine stimulus in and of itself is just like going and grabbing the 45 from the bottom of the rack, picking it up, putting it at the top. And in your case, it's like basically filling up plate after plate after plate, especially if you are training alone, like you got to, let's just say add 8 to 10 plates, potentially on either side of something. It's like that alone needs to be looked at as something that is contributing to the net stimulus, and the additional stimulus that you get in tandem with, all the lower body things and the upper body things that you're already doing. So I think it's a really good point. And in addition, even things that are not directly loaded from a, we'll call it back training perspective, like, a traditional lat pull down where you have a thigh pad or even a chest supported row. Like there's still all of the spine management stuff that needs to come along with muscles constantly pulling on your spine, like the lats, like the traps, and like the QLs that basically need to help, stabilize the position if you're doing it unilaterally, the posterior obliques that are helping you do that unilaterally. So yeah, just for me personally and for the average person, think that um, in general, I'm comfortable saying that the traditional lower body stuff like squats and hinges, uh, I would say that they're overrated just relative to how people talk about them, meaning that we have magnified their importance so much that we have neglected to realize just how much overlap there already is in a program with training all of those same qualities. And so when you arrive at a point where you're on week 8 of doing deadlifts, and let's say you get hurt, or maybe you just start to experience that sort of spinal tightness, that hip fatigue, it might not just be because of the specific motion that you're doing or that you added, but that was the kind of volume that sort of tipped you over your total volume tolerance at the end of the day, given all of the other things that you were already having to manage and didn't realize that you were having to manage, from a spine perspective. And this obviously becomes even more important when you're someone maybe who is doing or has a job where you are moving boxes, or maybe your job as a personal trainer, you're just on your feet all day. Like those are the kinds of things that I think end up adding up substantially, over time. So now when I want to train my spine directly, I tend not to opt for something like a deadlift. I tend to opt for something that is more specific to spinal flexion and spinal extension, be it like a cable crunching or a side bending motion, or just like a hyper extension on the hip extension machine and those kinds of things, because so many of those quote isometric qualities already get trained in so many different avenues. That box sort of just gets checked by the very nature of the fact that you're in the gym, you're picking shit up all the time, you're moving shit around, you're bending over and you're standing up to change a setting on a machine. And so I think that those are considerations that are really important to just, like you said, consider in the total, in the grand scheme of things. Um, so one of the things, did you have anything else to add on that sort of a level before we get to some other specific questions, comments here from the group?
Nope, ready.
Cool. So, um, one of the one of the questions, and this sort of harkens back to what we were talking about earlier on, it's just about general things like structure and categorization of squats versus hinges. Um, is this model, and to be specific about the question, one of our members was just asking, like, are you familiar with this model of human movement that basically says that if you have this particular structure, then you will be better at XYZ motion. So the most distilled way to put it is, generally speaking, people who are of a narrower frame, right? They have, a rib cage that's a little bit flatter, is a little bit more acute in terms of its angle, what's called the infrasternal angle. People generally say that like the narrower person is going to have an easier time squatting, and the wider person is going to have an easier time hinging. And I think that those kinds of claims and those kinds of beliefs are the very beliefs that drive you to either make a decision that is perfectly aligned with your goals and your structure and what you're capable of doing, or it's the kind of belief that drives you in the exact opposite direction of what you structurally are capable of doing and comfortable of doing longer term. And so, much to our conversation earlier about just looking at the knee, just looking at the angle, just looking at the hip, just looking at a single variable of like, what is the shape of your rib cage, and are you a wider person or a more narrower person? Are you underweight? Are you overweight? Those kinds of things are not unhelpful, but those are the kinds of things that I think ignore the bigger picture, and the sort of amalgamation of all these important variables that can lead people to, again, hitting the mark perfectly and accidentally, or hitting the mark so far, or sorry, being so far away from hitting the mark, right? That like you just end up sort of running yourself into a wall, regardless of what you do. I think the more principle based that you can be about the decision making process, and the less specific and sort of regurgitating you can be about what you've heard and about what people say is right for what particular person, and the more that you can look at the individual level and say what feels good for me, what doesn't feel good for me, what feels good for my client, what doesn't feel good for my client, the better able you're going to be and the more open-minded that you're capable of being in terms of actually making, changes. So rather than being arbitrarily tied to this idea that if this person has the structure, they will be better at doing this or they will be worse at doing this, I just simply look at the person in front of me and say, what do I see in terms of the way they're executing this thing? Or if I'm talking about myself, what do I feel in terms of how I'm executing this thing? And how does that lend toward results or fatigue, which come hand in hand over time? I think that's a much more holistic way to sort of look at things. And like I said, I just think that the more specific the claim, the more that you should really look to zoom out and to sort of bring the claim in the context of all the other things, some of the things that we've talked about, because that's the only way realistically that you can actually apply it at a specific level. So in a sort of like inverse backwards kind of a way, um, the more specific the belief, the more that it's likely that that belief is going to completely fall apart across enough data points and enough experience with enough people. Did you have anything to add to that in particular?
Not that this is necessarily the way that the people like promoting this idea would suggest using it, but maybe like if someone, took it out of context and really wanted to just like use that paradigm to make, resistance exercise training decisions, would, for example, someone say like, well, Ethan, has a wide infrasternal angle, like therefore, a deadlift, is probably something like he would be pretty good at and might be, he might be more inclined to do that exercise than, maybe someone with a narrow infrasternal angle. Would that be one way that someone might, misuse that thought process?
Yeah, yeah, and in acute context, you can make a claim and just see what someone naturally does to begin with, and you can very easily confirm that belief and that bias based on what kind of tools you actually give someone. So, for example, um, let's imagine that we took Ethan, and Ethan has a really wide rib cage, a really puffy looking rib cage, and I hold the belief that Ethan is going to be better at hinging than squatting, and I give you a squat that is basically set up so that by the constraints of your femur length, your tibia length, your ankle mobility, the only way that you can do that squat is to hinge, right? Then I put you in a position where I essentially I pre-bunk the opinion, meaning like I put you in a situation that fits the bias that I was expecting you to serve, and I move you away because I'm sort of caught within the lens of that bias. I don't think that there are any other things that I could possibly do to you or for you that would make that bias not confirmed. So in your example, it's like, well, yeah, maybe if I put a bar in your back and I forced your torso to lean forward over your feet, and so you had to sort of hinge that, then I could say, oh, Ethan's wide. He was better at hinging and he naturally hinged this motion, right? But the second that I change any part of the constraint of that exercise, which could be as simple as changing the shoes that you're wearing, now all of a sudden everything is different. And so when I think you can, to the points that we've made so far, it's like if you just focus on a single variable, it's more than likely that you're going to, whether knowingly or not, apply apply the information you understand to sort of fit that bias because that's the only lens that you're looking through. And so when you can even take such a small step back which would might allow you to again change the shoe choice, change where you hold the implement, right? If I took the bar and instead of putting it on your back, I had you hold it in a front rack, or I gave you a safety squat, right? That squat now all of a sudden looks completely different, not because of anything related to your structure, but because of the way that you allowed the resistance to change its interaction with your structure. If that makes sense.
Yeah, so that's one part of the conversation of like, okay, for getting the stimulus, in this case, the population we're talking about is, people who want to, build muscle in a resistance training setting. And, for me, if the recommendation was like, okay, he's pretty good at, he's probably pretty good at deadlifting, maybe, or hinging, maybe we don't have to worry about, practicing that as much. Maybe we'll focus on either, directly getting better at, squatty type squatting that's very, vertical, pushing the knees forward, or whether there's specific exercises that I do, to get me better at those patterns. What you're saying is like, man, there's just so many other variables. It's like, first of all, what's the person's goal? Does like Ethan need more glutes and hamstrings? He need more quads, if his goal is to build muscle mass. Like, what's his injury history? Is this someone who has prior problems with their spine or not? Like, what's the fatigue cost of these choices? Like, what, to your point, like exercise selection, based on the implement we use, based on, in this case, like the machines we have available to, there are a lot of machines that, when set up appropriately, you don't really have much of an option. So
Mm-hmm.
there's that route of like, man, there's just so many other more relevant things to consider than that one, that one factor in isolation. Even if it is relevant somewhere, there's a lot of other things that probably supersede that in the real world. And I think the other end of that conversation is like, the rehab piece of it, which we've kind of gone over before, like the corrective side of things. So that thought process, again, harking back to that other episode with corrective exercise, it's like, well, if you are wide, and again, not saying this is directly what's being promoted, but just like the thought process that a lot of people will go through. If you're very wide or you're very narrow, that's a problem, and you should move more towards the middle. If you're very wide, you should move towards doing things that, promote sort of narrow like activities. If you're very narrow, wide like activities. And if you don't do so, you open yourself up to more problems. You're more likely to get injured, in this case, lifting, um, if you just go about life and resistance training in your wide ways or your narrow ways. And, that's, I think, another consideration in terms of like, is that, in and of itself, a fallacy and, one that we may have gone down ourselves at some point to say like, well, I might be more bulletproof. I might be more resilient to my ways, if I can just do a little bit of this other stuff, if I can just balance my poor wide behaviors with some narrow behaviors, it might make all this, a little bit more sustainable. And then again, just like we kind of can miss the forest for the trees by just looking at that single variable and trying to choose an exercise based on it. In my experience is a lot of people might miss the forest for the trees in terms of not having a good understanding of the majority of what's, placing stress on their body in terms of like what exercises they're choosing and how they're performing those, and just really narrowing in on, again, this, rib cage situation, and uh, focusing less on their, the behaviors that make up, 95% of the stress they're incurring, and focusing on this, 1% thing where it's like, well, if I improve this thing, then automatically everything else will just kind of domino into place. And that's sort of a fallacy of like, if I can correct this one piece, it then corrects, all the others. If I take this, TRT injection, it corrects for my bad nutrition, my poor activity, and and it's like, well, a lot of times by, inserting this thing that is supposed to be, the sort of like the saving grace, you kind of miss the forest for the trees and just end up in the same place, over and over again.
Yeah, and one of the to follow up on that, one of the comments that one of another one of our members put in just as like a sub a subsection of that was she said many people with a narrow frame often present with like rounded shoulders and like a depressed sternum, which is often referred to as swayback, which I think is a totally egregious term to basically make people feel like they're broken when they're not. And she basically asked, do you find that narrower frame clients often find it difficult to target certain muscles, like hamstrings or glutes when they're hinging or like pecs when they're pressing? And it's like, yeah, absolutely. That is a trend that you see where people who are sort of starting in this more slump thing end up having to maybe try to make themselves more wide to accomplish these other things. But it's not because of the fact that they can't do those other things. It's just because like these, much like the long, short femur person, it's like these are just the constraints and their starting point. And you can do things to make that starting point a little bit, we'll say, different, or just to put that starting point in a little bit of a different position, whether it's through changing the orientation of your body or changing the resistance, and you can make it more aligned with the goal that you're trying to accomplish. But you can do that without assuming that that person is going to be bad at that particular thing or that they're going to be less inclined, right? Because I've seen just as many people who are narrow execute a perfect hinge as I have, people who are wide and vice versa. Um, and I think just to your point of the narrower opinion, and specifically like this sway back thing is a really good example where when you when you have a very specific claim, and usually when you have a very specific claim, like what the concepts that we're talking about now, which is like, okay, if you present with this posture, then you will be good at these things. And if you're good at these things, then you should do these things. And if you do these things, then you'll improve these qualities. And if you improve these qualities, then circle back to the beginning, you'll just be a better human. You'll be more functional, whatever it happens to be. The more specific the original claim, the more that you need to outline a very specific roadmap of outcomes that you can't possibly predict. And the more that you do that as a person who maybe doesn't have a ton of experience, the more confident you feel, right? Because if A equals B and B equals C, then A equals C sort of a thing, right? But the leap from A to C from one person to the next could be spot on. It could be the least, probable thing to happen in that particular case. And so the more specific opinion creates more security, but it also creates a false sense of security because the second that that one opinion, that one paradigm you have doesn't work, now all of a sudden you're sort of like left in the middle of the desert looking around like, okay, what do I do next? Now I don't have any tools, right? But if you are able to sort of zoom out and look at different variables, when thing A doesn't work out, now I can go over to thing X, right? Maybe instead of, trying to get this person to do a barbell squat, maybe I get them to do a front squat, right? Just as one example, rather than sort of being tied to that paradigm. So I think the uber specific opinion leads to the uber specific confidence. And when that bias and that experience of that bias is confirmed, you are left feeling like super energized and confident and like you can just solve any problem. And then the second that you encounter the person that none of that shit works for, everything falls apart and all of a sudden you're left with just zero tools to be able to problem solve. So all this stuff kind of goes back with what we started with, which was the more that you are capable of revising opinions and not being attached to any specific modality, system, or opinion, the more that you can actually navigate across a bunch of different contexts rather than just the single context that is presented to you on any given day. And the coolest part about this is that maybe some people don't find it cool in the moment, where you may have success with the wide person or the narrow person with this kind of an approach on day one. But what happens on day 60 when now all of a sudden it no longer works? So even within the same person, that person is capable of changing. Like you specifically are an extreme example of like someone who can go from looking much more narrow to looking and being much more wide. over the course of however many years, the strategies that work for you then will no longer work for you now. It's sort of the same principle, just applied on a little bit of a different, time scale.
So, are there any situations now where that where the thought process of like wide versus narrow infrasternal angle, or maybe like this person, is going to find it a little bit easier to, stand on their left leg versus their right leg, or rotate this way versus that way. Like some of these, prior biases that we had in terms of like how the body's set up and just sort of what a person is probably more likely to be successful at based on their structure and based on kind of sort of the underlying human asymmetries. Is, does that information ever, strongly does it ever influence in any way, or either like your explanations to clients or how you go about selecting or setting up an exercise these days?
So, as far as I'm consciously aware of it, because I'm sure on some level it might, but as far as I'm consciously thinking about it, I kind of view all those things as like, whipped cream on the ice cream, to where I will pretty much never assume anything about the way that someone is going to move or what they're going to feel until they're in that experience and until I hear some kind of report back. Um, but if they get to a point where all else seems to fail and I feel like I need an additional tool or an alternative strategy, I may resort to some of those principles or some of those strategies if, what my more generalized approach was can't accomplish those things. But I just think that, starting from a blank slate is always the right place to start. And, as Tom would say, just to kind of investigate and to receive information as you go and to pivot based off of what you receive. I think that is something that works across all contexts. And by work, I don't mean that you will be successful with it immediately or even after a week, 2 weeks, a long time. But eventually you get to a point where you've identified enough variables to have a better understanding of what may move this person in the direction that you want and what may move them further from the direction that you want. So I think where this is maybe most applicable and most helpful is with the upper body stuff directly. So as one of our members said, like she herself is a narrower person, a more like slumped over posturally person, which is totally fine, totally normal. Millions and millions, billions of people present that way, right? Probably half the population or more. Um, those are the kinds of people that, generally speaking, just purely from a mechanical perspective, will have a harder time on average connecting with a pressing motion. And they generally, within the context of a pressing motion, will tend to feel more delt stuff, more shoulder stuff, as compared to more pec stuff. So that's something that probably is an inbuilt assumption in me at this point, which is if the narrow person walks through the door, I'm probably going to have to teach them a little bit more about trunk position in a press as compared to someone who more naturally is sort of sitting with that arched posture. And the opposite may apply to someone who's a little bit wider, a little bit more proud postured, where those people tend to, in the inverse, on pulling motions, feel a lot more stuff in their upper back region as compared to their lat region. And the people who are narrow tend to have the opposite, presentation. And I say tend to because obviously, someone immediately, if you set them up and they're a narrow person, they have an easier time feeling upper back or lats or whatever, and the wide person may as well. But just from a structural standpoint, that the most direct influences in that regard are usually with the pressing and the pulling stuff, and everything else I've found to just be like a 50-50. Who knows what the hell is going to happen, especially with squats and hinges. There's just too many factors that contribute to those things, if that makes sense. um so then the last thing, and just to kind of and I can kind of combine this with one of the anecdotes I wanted to give today. um One of our members asked, in your opinion, is it necessary to use the belt and knee sleeves for lower body pressing stuff? Um, my immediate answer is no. Um, I don't think it's necessary. I don't think anything is necessary. I don't think it's necessary for you to squat or do a lower body press at all if you don't want to, or if it's not relevant to your goals. But I understand the question, which is like, if you are going to do a heavy leg press, a heavy squat, would you advise someone right off the bat to use knee sleeves and a belt? And I would actually say I would almost always advise the opposite, to where the knee sleeves and the belt may actually function as something that will uh, artificially buttress you against fatigue that you may otherwise experience. Meaning that if you're wearing a belt, that may be something that can give you good feedback to brace against and to use to improve your bracing. But it also robs you of the ability to actually learn how to brace without the constraint of the belt or without the compression of the knee sleeve and what those things may provide. So I'm always going to opt to not use those tools off the bat so I can actually teach people how to move. But I think there's nothing wrong with, especially in the context of powerlifting, right? Any advantage that you can get in the context of powerlifting is one that you want to opt to take. But I think in terms of general training, that would be my stance. Would you say something similar?
Yeah, 100%. I mean, you use that word like buttress, and you could also say like it just kind of like maybe maybe like shields your ability, or just kind of clouds your ability, to assess what's going on. It's like, this extra layer of support not only allows you to use, potentially more load, which can have impacts elsewhere. It's like maybe you have the knee sleeves on and that, impacts the back more, or maybe the knee sleeves don't allow you to really like perceive what's happening at the knee. Um, I just find in general, like those things, although acutely they make you feel better, I think they just kind of add more of this like chronic load in the background that can potentially just lead to like a more, catastrophic event down the line. It's like you're able to accumulate potentially more stress, in that acute setting, but it just adds up and it adds up. And it's like if you're not, um, if you're not getting it right in the first place, if you're not following a good like principle based approach, to how you're doing the exercise, you're just basically allowing yourself to accumulate more and more stress that you otherwise wouldn't be able to tolerate. So again, it's not that, I would never use that, but it's not something that I have any of my clients, currently using. It's not something that I use myself, and it's certainly things that I've experimented with in the past. So it's not to say that I haven't used both of those implements, but I found more often than not they were trying to cover something up, rather than it was something that just like um, allowed me to get more stimulus with no additional consequence. So I guess what I'm kind of rambling here, but I guess my general thought is just like I would rather have more clarity. Like I would rather have better like interoceptive feedback. Like I would rather have better acute feedback and be able to know where I'm at in terms of pain, in terms of sensation, than be able to just accumulate more stress without being able to, really perceive what's going on. But again, if it's your sport, there's going to be a time and place for that.
Yeah, I think what we're really describing are like the second and third order consequences of being able to just do more without actually asking whether or not like where that more is coming from is what we really want. And just to give a specific example is like you mentioned with the knee sleeves and like perception of knee position, your knees may feel better using knee sleeves, uh, but it may be because you're not able to bend your knees as much, right? Because of the constraint of the actual fabric of the sleeve. So if let's say are doing pendulum squats and you're using knee sleeves and your knees feel better, it might not have anything to do with the knee sleeve, but the second order effect of your knee sleeves preventing you from putting your knees into a position that you may not be comfortable putting your knees into, right? Same goes for a belt. A belt may physically prevent you from flexing your spine in, let's say, the context of a back squat or a deadlift, just because of the physical constraints of the belt. But it's not because of the belt, it's because of how you change your position as a consequence of the belt. So it sounds like those things are the same, but I don't think that they're the same at all. And I think that learning to do, learning to understand where your knees are comfortable going to, and learning to understand how to control and manipulate spine position in relationship to hip position, I think those are sort of the big things that from a skill standpoint carry over to all exercises, um, in all contexts, regardless of what gym um, that you're actually in.
Yeah.
So
I can see where it could be confusing too, because we talk about like, the idea of anchors and like, these external restraints and, putting yourself in a machine where you can really like, feel where you are in space and push against things. And so I can see where the natural extension of that might be, well, why not, in a less constrained exercise, add a belt, add a knee sleeve, and maybe, yeah, maybe that does limit motion a little bit, but maybe that's a good thing. Like I could see where, someone might make that next leap, because then we're going with the logic of, well, you should learn to do these things on your own. Whereas in other exercises, like when we were talking about the back squat, it was like, well, maybe, just choose a better exercise. So, maybe we should be a little more specific on like what the difference between those two things are.
yeah, that's a really good point. So what I would like to break down the big picture takeaway in terms of like, let's let's imagine you're doing a back squat and you could either use a belt to do the back squat or do like a pendulum squat, for example. Um, the big difference between simply adding the belt and changing the exercise as a whole is when you just add the belt, you don't really change the actual force constraints of the exercise. You change how you are internally relating to your own position. And to me, those things are totally distinct, right? Because there's no way that you can possibly ever get a back squat in terms of the forces of a back squat to be similar to the forces of a pendulum squat, both in terms of the direction that you're moving and how you're actually pushing into the floor or the platform or whatever. So in one instance, you are altering how you have to execute an exercise based on the constraints of the exercise. And in another instance, you are altering the way that you organize your body within the framework of the mechanics of the exercise. So the mechanics of the exercise is kind of like the bigger box, and like adding a belt would be the smaller box within the bigger box. But changing the bigger box is really the thing that is going to move where the stimulus ends up being. And changing the smaller box may give you that extra 5, 10, 20% of skill, execution, competency, but it's not going to be a change that essentially at a higher priority or a higher level of magnitude is going to alter the outcome of the exercise. So what I would say is, while you can add the constraint of a belt and that may improve your execution in something like a back squat, it's completely distinct from altering the entirety of the exercise altogether, because in each of those cases those are two sort of separate big boxes to me, and adding the belt within each of them may change your execution within those, but ultimately what you're aiming to do in terms of, we'll say, the general principle of anchoring is you're aiming to set up the big box so that the constraints of that bigger box align directly with the goal, where you may, in the case of adding a belt to a back squat, be sort of jamming, a square peg into a round hole situation, where even though within the context of that bigger box, you improved your execution, you still had this opportunity to pick something that was way more aligned with what the goal outcome of that opportunity would be in the first place. Do you think that was clear enough?
Yeah, yeah, that makes sense. And I know with the belt specifically, like there is like a some body of, evidence in the research just looking at like EMG activity, around, the trunk, and, looking at outcomes. Like I know that people can lift more weight, typically when they add a belt, and there's some, obviously, powerlifters do it for a reason. But and I've spoken to Stu McGill about this, as well, who is not someone who who does not generally recommend, wearing belts for people who are not, competitive powerlifters. Um, and that's something he had passed on to me as well, is like, that concept of generally the person, who wears the belt to sort of like work around the solution is the person who ends up much worse, in my clinic further down the line versus it's to your point of like, doesn't really change the forces directly of the exercise itself. You're just kind of working around it. So I guess like, another question that might come up for someone in this position is, let's say they're doing, a pendulum squat and they have knee pain, but they find when they add the knee sleeves or the knee wraps on, they no longer have knee pain, and that's even the case, on a week to week basis. It's the knee pain doesn't seem to be getting worse as long as they're wearing their knee sleeves. They feel okay. What would you suggest to that person that's like, I can do this exercise as long as I, have my knee sleeves, or my belt on?
Yeah, I'm certainly not of the opinion that putting the knee sleeves on in that instance is like inherently a bad thing. But what I would, because what you'll commonly hear is like, oh, you'll rely on the knee sleeves and that's bad. It's like, well, maybe you're relying on the knee sleeves, but if the net outcome is much better, and you've chosen an exercise that provides constraints that align closely with the goal, I don't see anything super negative about that. But what I would say in this particular case, and what I would encourage, is that you have to consider every exercise that you do, not just within the context of the exercise itself, but within the entire framework of your training. So, for example, the pendulum squat does not exist in isolation and in a vacuum, right? It exists within the context of you doing leg extensions, maybe lunges, maybe leg presses, right? So the second that you remove yourself from that context, or maybe just you find yourself in a situation where you don't have access to the knee sleeves, right? Maybe you're traveling, maybe you're using a different machine, and for whatever reason you're not using them, whatever it happens to be. Uh, in my mind, what being able to control, we'll say in this case, that bottom end of the range does for you is on a principle level, it allows you to gain some measure of competency in the action of controlling knee flexion eccentrically. So whether that's you doing a pendulum squat, you doing a free weight squat, you doing a leg extension, you doing a hack squat, a lunge, a reverse lunge, a split squat, that is an action that, well, I don't like this word, but like neurologically applies across a whole host of different scenarios. Um, Wherein if you don't have the knee sleeves, or if you're not using the knee sleeves in those contexts, you may not have the ability to execute those motions in the same way that would be beneficial as it was in the pendulum. So I would say that it's not necessarily, I wouldn't describe it as a reliance of that person, but I would just think that from a principle based standpoint and overall execution standpoint, that learning to control motion of any joint without the added physical constraint of the compression of the sleeves and what it's trying to do to your knee and how it's stopping you from moving, that is something that if you remove it in that one context, will allow you to, I think, better coordinate that kind of motion, that category of motion and loading in all other contexts. Even in the context, let's say, of something that would be loading you oppositely, right? Like as in a leg curl of any kind, right? You essentially, even in one instance, although the muscle recruitment is sort of opposite, um, I don't think it makes sense to sort of isolate quad motions from hamstrings motions in that regard of like the bigger picture principle of control of knee motion. And so I think that if our goals are to be able to uh, gain an ability to control knee motion in general, that not only applies across quad based things, but also knee flexion um, based things, as well. And that's also, it's pretty obvious why people don't use knee sleeves in something like a leg curl, right? Is because it would be adding resistance against the intended motion, which, maybe there's an application for that. I haven't found it. Um, but I just think sort of zooming out and maybe viewing it a little bit more generally in the context of other motions and in the context of knee flexion, knee extension in general, I think that's sort of where I would take that thought.
Yeah, so kind of breaking it down and saying like instead of, just this exercise that we have a name for, this thing hurts me and it doesn't hurt me if I do this, maybe asking like, well, what are the implications of this exercise? Like, what sort of forces am I dealing with? And, are they greater at the bottom of this exercise, versus, another one? So maybe in this example, like you try a reverse band, maybe on the pendulum squat, and that's at least something you can kind of gauge in terms of like, changing how heavy the band is, relative to how much, load you have on the machine. And then you can begin towards working towards controlling the bottom of that position with as much resistance as you can handle at that particular time. So it doesn't necessarily have to just be knee sleeve or no knee sleeve. It might be that the pendulum just you're dealing with a tremendous amount of stress in that bottom position. How can we kind of temper that stress and either find a place over time where it's kind of an appropriate balance in terms of like what you can control at the bottom, to how much stimulus you're getting in the motion, um, to versus just saying like I'm going to put the heaviest band possible at the reverse band on this pendulum squat, or I'm going to put the I'm going to wrap my knee wraps as tight as I possibly can, and just really eliminating that whole portion. Maybe it's kind of gradually working into that portion, whether it be through that exercise, or through another exercise, just understanding like these are the forces that I'm having difficulty dealing with. Instead of going from 0 to 60, maybe I can gradually work my way into those positions with, sort of a gradual increase, in resistance there.
Yeah, and I would also say in terms of the conversation around context, you could make the argument that in the pendulum, like imagine a scenario where the pendulum squat without the knee sleeves hurts, but with the knee sleeves it doesn't hurt, right? And so forgetting about what we've discussed so far in terms of like just the potential reasons that could be, um, or no, one of those would be important to actually in this example list, which might be like just that terminal position of knee flexion where your knees are as bent as they can be. Maybe loading that position for whatever reason right now is problematic for you with the loading direction and the constraints of a pendulum squat. Maybe it's just for now it's problematic. You might assume that because I've seen people do this, they'll use knee sleeves in the context of the pendulum, but no other knee dominant exercise. And what they might assume is, okay, well, if I don't use knee sleeves on the pendulum and it hurts, then I'll use them on that exercise, but then I won't use them on any other exercise because, like say a split squat, because in a split squat, it doesn't hurt when I fully bend my knee. But that doesn't necessarily mean that you are not continuing to contribute to the problem that you were experiencing on the pendulum squat. You may just in the situation of a pendulum squat, or sorry, in the situation of a split squat rather, or a lunge, that same sort of eroding problem may be getting worse just below the level of your perception, right? So you may actually be contributing to the problem that is manifesting in the pendulum squat, and that you're simply just not aware of the fact that below the threshold of your pain perception or your discomfort perception, you're not able to actually sort of experience those things because the resistance direction is different. There's less torque on the knee, whatever it is, but you don't necessarily know that it's not contributing, to that, to what's manifesting. So I think that's a good thing to sort of touch on, which is just this concept of all exercises interacting with one another. And while in some cases it may be super obvious that a single exercise is problematic, it's very difficult to make the assertion, at least clearly, that that exercise is the problem. Because ultimately, much like the spine stuff we're talking about, it's the sort of net total of all the different stresses that you're accumulating. And some stresses may be more difficult to perceive a problem within as compared to others. It's like the pendulum squat in this case could just be the straw on the camel's back that's like, allowing this issue to manifest in real time, whereas the other exercises, even something like a leg extension, might not be.
Mhm.
Cool. So we're pretty deep here. I think we'll I just want to finish off quickly with one um anecdote to kind of tie things together. And then next week we'll cover the specific stuff. We'll go through all the specific muscle groups. Um because I think it may be helpful. Not so me in the context of my program, I don't currently do anything that is super erector dominant. Like I don't do RDLs, I don't do deadlifts, I don't do back squats. But in recent weeks, I added back in um, volume in the pendulum squat. And this week that we're currently on was week 3. Week 1, I started with 2 sets, the first of which was not to failure, the second of which was to failure. Week 2, I did 2 sets again, but I did both sets to failure. And then week 3 on this week, um, and this is maybe a good experience to illustrate how, uh, what's the phrase? Do as I say, not as I do. I went to 4 sets, um, 3 of which were to failure, right? So from week 2 to week 3, I added 2 sets and then I added an additional set to failure. And the reason I did that was just because I was feeling really good. I was high on life. The vibes were good. It was Friday. I was like, why the hell not? My legs were pumped. It was sick. Um, later on Friday, started feeling some like low back fatigue, interestingly. So nothing knee related. And then yesterday, Saturday, I woke up and I went to bend over to grab something off the floor, and it was like immediate tweak in the low back. And it was like one of those tweaks I had experienced years ago. It was like super sharp, super focal, left SI related thing. And so I think this is just a good lesson to maybe encapsulate some of the concepts that we're talking about, where I may look to the pendulum squat, much like I may look to the RDL or to the deadlift and say, oh, this was the thing, this is bad. But just in the way that we were describing, why a back squat or a deadlift might eventually be the sort of the tipping point for you, even something like a pendulum squat, which is obviously axially loaded, right, can create that same effect, even though the forces on the spine are far reduced relative to, something like a deadlift. Um, in that instance, it was just like I had made this load progression, or sorry, this volume progression, this effort progression that was clearly too much for me to handle from one week to the next. So in terms of like how I navigated this, um, the first thing I did not do was I didn't freak out. I didn't assume that my entire program was falling apart. I didn't assume that my back was broken. And I didn't assume that it was going to be fixed in a day. So what I did was yesterday, I just got a lot of steps. I didn't sort of add any kind of like, additional exercise to quote unquote fix the issue. I didn't try to make it feel better. I didn't explore where it felt more painful. I just tried to, generally speaking, find more comfort when I was sitting and walking, however that happened to be, and I didn't do anything else. And now today I woke up, there's no tweak. There's a little bit of a sense of fatigue, kind of just like the area is sore. And I'm confident by tomorrow, the soreness will either be unnoticeable or, pretty much gone. So I think that that's a very common experience for people to have, is that like tweaking kind of a thing. And I think that it's important that, just to give some perspective, that we don't necessarily blame the specific exercise, because at times it can feel like that's the only thing that was problematic, rather than the way in which we went about managing the whole picture. And then hopefully that anecdote was helpful just in terms of like how to navigate that kind of thing, is to not freak out, you know, get some pain-free movement, nothing that is strenuous, sleep it off. And, today it's like I, don't really even notice it just sitting here. Um, so that was kind of what I wanted to finish with. If you have any sort of final comments, things to add.
I mean, I added a hack, well, a different version, more like, a more actually loaded version of the hack squat in last week, whereas previously I was doing one that was, more loaded at the hips and lumbar spine. So yeah, something to keep in mind, for my own training here. It is the last exercise I do for the day. So I purposely come in with my legs, pretty fatigued, and I can't use a whole lot of load by the time I get to that point. But again, just going back to a previous episode on training to failure, this can be a good time, to stray away from that potentially, even if the rest of my program features exercises that I've been doing for many months and taking to failure.
Yeah. All right. Cool. So next week we'll start quads, glutes, hamstrings, calves, adductors, lateral hip, and we'll sprinkle some spine in there maybe too, just because it's kind of part of it.